The text that changed everything arrived at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Mom, we need to talk about your financial delusions. This inheritance fantasy has gone too far. I stared at the message from my eldest daughter, Rebecca, my hands trembling in the dim glow of my phone screen. 20 minutes later, another message, this time from my son David. The family is worried about your mental state. Maybe it's time to consider assisted living. The third message came from my youngest, Sarah. We love you, but you're living in Delulu land about money that doesn't exist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Walsh, and at 72 years old, I never imagined my own children would gaslight me about my own finances. But here I was, sitting in my modest kitchen in suburban Denver, being told I was delusional about money I'd spent decades accumulating. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were calling me delusional while simultaneously planning how to spend what they believed was their inheritance. It started 6 months earlier when I mentioned during our monthly family dinner that I was considering updating my will. Not because I was planning to die anytime soon, mind you, but because my financial advisor had suggested it during our annual review. I'd been fortunate in my investments, more fortunate than my children realized, and I wanted to ensure everything was properly documented. Oh, Mom, Rebecca had laughed, cutting into her salmon with practiced precision. You don't need to worry about a will. It's not like you have some secret fortune hidden away. She'd said it with that condescending tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that made me feel like a child being patted on the head. David had chimed in with his typical bluntness. Honestly, after Dad's medical bills and the house maintenance, there probably isn't much left anyway. We're not expecting anything, but his eyes had darted around my dining room, cataloging the antique furniture and art pieces I'd collected over the years, and I could see the calculations running behind his expression. Sarah, ever the diplomat, had tried to soften the blow. What David means is that we love you for you, not for any money. We just want you to be comfortable in your retirement. Yet she'd been the one asking pointed questions about my monthly expenses and suggesting I might want to downsize to something more manageable. The conversation had planted a seed of unease that grew over the following months. My children began treating me like I was losing touch with reality whenever money came up. When I mentioned that I was comfortable financially, they'd exchange those looks that parents give when their toddler insists monsters live under the bed. When I talked about charitable donations I'd made, they'd gently suggest I might want to keep better track of my spending. The breaking point came when I casually mentioned that I was considering taking a European river cruise, something I'd always wanted to do but had put off during my working years. The reaction was swift and coordinated in a way that suggested they'd been discussing my condition behind my back. Mom, that's a $15,000 trip, Rebecca had said, her voice laced with the patience of someone explaining basic math to a confused elderly person. I don't think you understand how much money that is. Maybe we should make an appointment with your doctor, David had suggested. Sometimes medications can affect judgment about financial decisions. Sarah had been more direct. Mom, we're worried you're losing touch with reality about your finances. Living beyond your means won't help anyone. That night, I'd sat in my study looking at the quarterly statements from my investment accounts, the property deeds, the insurance policies, and the various certificates of deposit I'd accumulated over 47 years of careful saving and smart investing. The numbers were real, the money was real. But according to my children, I was living in Delulu land about my own financial situation. What they didn't know was that their father, Robert, and I had been incredibly disciplined savers from the moment we got married. While other couples were buying new cars and taking expensive vacations, we'd lived modestly and invested the difference. Robert had been particularly gifted with stock picks, and I'd inherited his knack for spotting undervalued companies. After his death 5 years ago, I'd continued managing our portfolio with the help of a trusted financial advisor, and the results had exceeded even my own expectations. But somehow, my children had convinced themselves that I was living in a fantasy world about money that didn't exist. They'd created an elaborate delusion where their practical, financially responsible mother had suddenly become a spendthrift with grandiose ideas about wealth she didn't possess. The morning after receiving those text messages, I called my financial advisor James Morrison, a man I'd worked with for over a decade. "James, I need you to prepare a comprehensive overview of my accounts," I said, settling into my favorite armchair with my morning coffee. "I think it's time my children understood exactly what they're calling delusional." "Of course, Mrs. Walsh," James replied, and I could hear the clicking of his keyboard. "Should I include the recent performance of your tech stock portfolio? It's been quite remarkable this quarter." "Include everything," I said firmly. "The investment accounts, the real estate holdings, the bonds, the life insurance policies, everything." "Mrs. Walsh, if you don't mind me asking, is everything all right? You sound stressed." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My children think I'm losing my mind because I mentioned wanting to take a cruise. Apparently, believing I can afford a $15,000 trip means I'm living in Delulu land." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Walsh, your liquid assets alone could fund dozens of such trips. Are you sure they understand your financial position?" "That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out, James." 2 hours later, I had a 40-page financial summary printed and bound, complete with account statements, property valuations, and investment performance charts. The bottom line was staggering, even to me. Through careful investing, compound interest, and some particularly lucky stock picks, Robert and I had accumulated a portfolio worth just over $2 million. Add in the house, which had appreciated significantly in Denver's hot real estate market, and various other assets, and my net worth approached $4 million. I stared at the number, written in black and white on James's letterhead. $4 million. I was, by any reasonable definition, wealthy. Yet my children were treating me like a confused elderly woman who didn't understand the difference between fantasy and reality. That afternoon, I did something I rarely did. I called each of my children and asked them to come over that evening for a family meeting. The urgency in my voice must have concerned them because all three agreed immediately, probably expecting to stage some kind of intervention about my supposed financial delusions. Rebecca arrived first, dressed in her usual power suit, her expensive handbag clutched tightly as if she were heading into a business negotiation rather than visiting her mother. She'd inherited her father's sharp features and my stubborn streak, a combination that had served her well in her career as a corporate lawyer but sometimes made her difficult to deal with on a personal level. "Mom, we're really worried about you," she said before she'd even sat down. "These ideas about having money for expensive trips, it's just not realistic given your situation." David came in as she was speaking, his contractor's clothes, still dusty from whatever job site he'd been working. At 45, he was the most practical of my children, someone who dealt in concrete facts and measurable results. "Hi, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. "How are you feeling today?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"Any confusion or memory issues?" The condescension in his voice made my jaw clench, but I forced myself to remain calm. Sarah arrived last, as usual, carrying a bag from the organic grocery store and wearing the kind of flowing clothes that suggested she'd come straight from her yoga studio. At 38, she was the family peacekeeper, always trying to smooth over conflicts and find middle ground. "I brought your favorite herbal tea," she said, unpacking the bag. "I thought it might help you relax and think more clearly about everything." Think more clearly. As if the problem was my thinking rather than their assumptions. "Before we start," I said, gesturing for them to sit around my dining room table, "I want each of you to tell me exactly what you think my financial situation is. Be specific." They exchanged those looks again, the ones that said they were humoring a confused elderly person. Rebecca spoke first, her lawyer's training evident in how she organized her thoughts. "Mom, we know you have your Social Security, Dad's pension, and probably some savings. Maybe $50,000 or $60,000 total? The house is paid off, which is great, but property taxes and maintenance costs are only going up. We're not saying you're poor, but you're certainly not wealthy enough to be spending $15,000 on a cruise." David nodded in agreement. And with inflation and healthcare costs, you need to be more careful about preserving what you have. Dad's medical bills really depleted your savings in those last few years. Sarah leaned forward with her characteristic earnestness. Mom, we love that you want to enjoy your retirement, but we don't want you to spend money you don't have and then become a burden on us later. It's better to be realistic about your limitations now. A burden on them later. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just dismissing my financial reality. They were already calculating the cost of taking care of me when my imaginary money ran out. I see, I said quietly. So you all believe I have approximately $60,000 in savings, plus Social Security and Dad's pension. Well, maybe a bit more, Rebecca said charitably. But definitely not enough to justify luxury spending. I reached for the financial portfolio James had prepared and placed it in the center of the table. I think it's time you learned exactly how delusional your mother really is. The change in their expressions as they began flipping through the pages was almost comical. Rebecca's professional composure cracked first as she reached the investment summary. Mom, what is this? These numbers can't be right. David was staring at a page showing my stock portfolio performance. This says you made $400,000 just this year on investments. That's impossible. Sarah had found the net worth summary and was reading it with her mouth slightly open. $3.8 million? Mom, this has to be a mistake. It's not a mistake, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Your father and I spent 47 years building that portfolio. We lived modestly, invested wisely, and never touched the principal. When he died, I continued following his investment strategy with James's help. Rebecca was frantically flipping through pages, her lawyer's brain trying to process the information. But how? You never acted like you had this kind of money. You drive a 10-year-old Toyota. You shop at discount stores. You live in the same house you've had for 30 years. Because we believed in living below our means, not flaunting our wealth, I replied. We wanted to ensure we had security and could leave something meaningful to our children. But apparently living modestly convinced you that I was poor. David was shaking his head in disbelief. Mom, if this is real, why didn't you ever tell us? We've been worrying about your financial security for years. I tried to tell you, I said, my patience finally wearing thin. Every time I mentioned being comfortable financially, every time I talked about making donations or taking trips, you treated me like I was having delusions of grandeur. You convinced yourselves that I was losing touch with reality rather than accepting that you might not know everything about my finances. Sarah looked up from the papers, tears in her eyes. Mom, we were just trying to protect you. We thought you were being taken advantage of or making poor decisions. No, I said firmly. You were protecting your own assumptions. You decided what my financial situation should be based on how I lived, and when reality didn't match your expectations, you chose to believe I was delusional rather than question your own perceptions. The room fell silent except for the sound of pages turning as they continued to absorb the scope of their miscalculation. Rebecca was the first to speak again, her voice smaller than usual. Mom, I owe you an enormous apology, we all do. But I have to ask, if you have this kind of money, why do you live so simply? I looked at my 3 children, these adults who thought they knew me but had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I valued. Because money isn't meant to be displayed, Rebecca. It's meant to provide security, freedom, and the ability to help others. Your father and I never needed expensive cars or designer clothes to feel wealthy. We felt wealthy because we had choices, because we could help people we cared about, because we knew we'd never be a burden on anyone. David was still staring at the investment statements. But we could have helped you manage this. We could have given you advice. You mean you could have spent it? I said quietly, and the truth of those words hung in the air like a challenge. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable, but necessary. My children had to confront the fact that they'd been so focused on what they assumed they would inherit that they'd completely misunderstood their mother's actual financial position. They'd created a narrative where I was a confused elderly woman with delusions of wealth, when the reality was that I was a savvy investor who'd simply chosen to live modestly. But the most painful realization was yet to come. As we talked through their assumptions and my actual financial situation, a pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. Over the past year, as they'd become more convinced of my financial delusions, they'd also become more proprietary about my spending and more interested in my future plans. Rebecca had started making comments about how I should probably stay in the house because moving expenses would be wasteful. David had begun suggesting home improvement projects that would, quote, add value for the future. Sarah had been encouraging me to spend time organizing my possessions and creating lists of who might want what when I was gone. They hadn't been protecting me from financial delusions. They'd been protecting what they thought would be their inheritance from my supposedly reckless spending. The cruel irony was that while they were worried about me wasting money that didn't exist, they were already mentally dividing up assets they'd never even bothered to understand. I need you all to leave now, I said finally, standing up from the table. I need time to think about what this means for our family. Rebecca reached for my hand. Mom, please don't be angry. We made a mistake, but we were trying to help. I pulled my hand away gently but firmly. Rebecca, you sent me a text message at 3 a.m. telling me I was living in Delulu land, about money I've spent 47 years accumulating. David, you suggested I needed medical evaluation because I wanted to take a cruise I can easily afford. Sarah, you've been treating me like a confused child who doesn't understand basic math. This wasn't a mistake. This was a fundamental failure to respect me as a competent adult. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, I could see them processing not just the money, but what it meant for their assumptions about inheritance. The calculation in their eyes had shifted from, how do we protect mom's limited resources, to, quote, how much of this will we get when she dies? That night, I sat in my study looking at the financial statements and thinking about what I'd learned about my children's characters. They loved me, I didn't doubt that, but they'd also been so focused on their future inheritance that they'd failed to see their mother as she actually was. They'd preferred to believe I was delusional rather than admit they didn't know everything about my life. The text messages I'd received weren't about concern for my well-being. They were about concern for their financial expectations. And now that they knew the money was real, I wondered if their relationship with me would change in ways that might be even more problematic than their previous condescension. Over the next few days, my phone rang constantly. Apologetic messages, requests for lunch, invitations to family dinners. Rebecca wanted to discuss investment strategies. David suddenly had ideas for wealth preservation. Sarah thought we should plan for the future together. But I'd learned something important about the difference between loving someone and respecting them. My children loved me, but they hadn't respected my competence, my intelligence, or my right to make my own financial decisions. They'd been so convinced they knew better that they'd dismissed my reality in favor of their assumptions. The real delusion hadn't been mine. The real delusion had been their belief that they understood my financial situation better than I did, and their assumption that they had any right to dictate how I should spend my own money. They'd been living in their own Delulu land, where Mom was a confused elderly woman whose resources needed to be preserved for their eventual benefit. Now they knew the truth. The question was what I was going to do about it. As I sat there in the quiet of my study, surrounded by the financial statements that proved my competence and the text messages that revealed their true priorities, I began to formulate a plan that would teach my children the most important lesson of their lives. They wanted to talk about delusions. I was about to show them what real delusion looked like. But first, I had some phone calls to make, and some very important decisions to finalize. My children thought they knew what their inheritance would be. They had no idea how wrong they were about to discover they'd been. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. For too long, I'd been allowing my children to make me question my own judgment, my own reality. But seeing their faces when they discovered the truth about my finances had crystallized something important. This wasn't just about money. This was about respect, autonomy, and the fundamental question of who gets to decide how a competent adult lives their life. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same way Robert and I used to plan our financial strategies decades ago. At the top of the page, I wrote, "What do I want my legacy to be?" Below that, I began listing everything I'd observed about my children's behavior over the past year. Rebecca's increasing comments about how I should preserve my resources. David's suggestions about home improvements that would add value. Sarah's gentle but persistent questions about my monthly expenses, and her recommendations to downsize my life. What I'd initially interpreted as loving concern now looked different through the lens of what I'd learned. They hadn't been worried about my well-being. They'd been worried about their inheritance. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Rebecca, calling at 8 in the morning with the kind of urgency she usually reserved for legal emergencies. "Mom, I've been up all night thinking about our conversation. I need to apologize properly. Could we have lunch today? Just the two of us?" I could hear the calculation in her voice, the lawyer in her already strategizing how to manage this new information. "I'm busy today, Rebecca. Please, Mom. I need to make things right between us. And honestly, I have some concerns about your portfolio allocation. Some of those tech stocks are quite volatile, and at your age, you might want to consider more conservative investments." There it was. Less than 24 hours after discovering I wasn't the financially incompetent mother she'd imagined, and she was already trying to manage my money. "Rebecca, I've been successfully managing investments for longer than you've been practicing law. I think I can handle my own portfolio." Of course. I just thought that with my background in corporate finance, I might be able to offer some insights. We could work together. Work together. What she meant was that she wanted control, or at least influence, over decisions involving millions of dollars. "I'll call you later in the week," I said, and hung up before she could respond. 20 minutes later, David called. His approach was more direct, as usual. "Mom, I've been thinking about your house. With that kind of net worth, you're probably paying way too much in property taxes. I could help you restructure some things, maybe set up a trust. I've been learning about estate planning." "Since when are you interested in estate planning, David?" "Since I realized my mother is sitting on a fortune and might not be taking advantage of all the tax benefits available to her." "Mom, you could be saving thousands every year with the right strategies." Again, the same pattern. Yesterday, they'd been treating me like I was incompetent to make a $15,000 travel decision. Today, they were positioning themselves as my financial advisors. "David, I have a financial advisor and an estate attorney. They've been handling these matters for years." "But Mom, they don't know you like family does. They don't have your best interests at heart the way we do." The irony was breathtaking. The same children who dismissed my financial judgment for months were now claiming they had my best interests at heart. "I need to go, David. I have appointments today." Sarah's call came an hour later, and her approach was different but equally transparent. "Mom, I feel terrible about how we've been treating you. I was talking to my therapist about it, and she helped me understand that we were projecting our own financial anxieties onto you. I want to make it up to you." "How do you plan to do that, Sarah?" "Well, I was thinking we could spend more time together. Maybe I could help you organize your financial documents, create a better system for tracking everything. And I've been researching some wonderful charitable organizations that might align with your values. Since you mentioned wanting to give back." Charitable organizations. Of course. Sarah had always been the most generous-hearted of my children, but I could hear the underlying assumption that she should have input into my philanthropic decisions. "Sarah, I've been making charitable donations for years. I don't need help deciding how to give away my own money." I know. I just thought that with this kind of wealth, you might want to make a bigger impact. I could research tax-efficient giving strategies." After I hung up, I realized that my children's reactions were following a predictable pattern. They'd moved seamlessly from treating me as incompetent to positioning themselves as indispensable. The money hadn't changed their fundamental view of me as someone who needed their guidance and management. It had just changed the scale of what they thought needed managing. That afternoon, I drove to James Morrison's office downtown. I'd called ahead and asked him to clear his schedule for an extended consultation. James was in his 50s, A thoughtful man who'd earned my trust over the years by never talking down to me or suggesting I didn't understand my own financial situation. "Mrs. Walsh, you sounded troubled on the phone. Is everything all right?" I handed him a copy of the portfolio summary he'd prepared. "My children saw this yesterday." Their reaction was enlightening. James studied my face with the perceptiveness that made him an excellent advisor. "I take it they were surprised by the numbers?" "Surprised, yes. But what happened next was more telling. Within 24 hours, all three of them had called offering to help me manage my money. The same children who'd been treating me like I was delusional about finances suddenly became financial experts." "Aha," James said, leaning back in his chair. "The inheritance effect." "The what?" "It's something I see frequently with wealthy clients. Family members who show little interest in someone's financial decisions suddenly become very involved once they understand the size of the estate. Usually their concern is less about the person's well-being and more about preserving what they see as their future inheritance." I felt a mixture of sadness and validation. "So this is normal?" "Unfortunately, yes. Money has a way of revealing people's true priorities. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" I'd been thinking about that question all morning. "James, I want to change my will." "Of course. What modifications did you have in mind?" "I want to remove my children as primary beneficiaries." James raised an eyebrow but didn't seem shocked. After 15 years of helping people manage wealth, he'd probably seen every variation of family financial drama. "That's a significant decision, Mrs. Walsh. May I ask what you're thinking of doing instead?" I pulled out the legal pad where I had been making notes. "I want to establish a charitable foundation. Something focused on financial literacy education for seniors. Too many elderly people are vulnerable to financial abuse from family members because they don't understand their rights or their worth." "That's a meaningful cause," James said thoughtfully. "And your children?" "They can each receive a modest bequest. Enough to know I loved them, but not enough to make them wealthy from my death." We spent the next 2 hours discussing the logistics. James explained how to structure a charitable foundation, the legal requirements, and the timeline for making such significant changes. He also recommended an estate attorney who specialized in complex philanthropic planning. "Mrs. Walsh, before we proceed, I feel obligated to ask if you've considered the possibility that your children's behavior might change once they adjust to this new information. Sometimes initial reactions aren't representative of people's true character." I appreciated his caution, but I'd been observing my children's character for decades. "James, this isn't about their initial reaction to discovering the money. This is about a year of treating me like an incompetent child, followed by immediately trying to position themselves as my financial managers. They haven't shown any genuine remorse for how they've treated me. They've just recalibrated their approach based on new information. That evening, I did something I rarely did. I opened a bottle of wine, something Robert and I had been saving for a special occasion. He'd been gone 5 years now, and I figured discovering my own strength qualified as special enough. As I sat in my living room, sipping wine and looking at family photos, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Robert before he died. He'd been worried about leaving me alone, concerned that our children might not understand how to support me without taking over my life. "They mean well," he'd said during one of our late-night talks in his final months. "But they've never had to be financially independent the way we were. They might not understand that you don't need taking care of, you need respecting." He'd been right, of course. My children had grown up with the security of knowing their parents were stable and responsible, but they'd never learned to see us as individuals with our own competence and judgment. To them, aging automatically meant declining capability, and having money they didn't know about meant I must be confused about reality. The wine was making me contemplative, and I found myself thinking about other elderly people who might be facing similar situations. How many competent older adults were being dismissed by well-meaning family members who thought they knew better? How many were having their autonomy slowly eroded by children who confused love with control? My phone buzzed with a text. Message from Rebecca. "Mom, I've been doing research on wealth management strategies for seniors. Could we schedule a time to discuss them?" I stared at the message, marveling at her complete lack of self-awareness. She was still operating under the assumption that discovering my wealth meant she should have input into managing it. The idea that I might be perfectly capable of handling my own financial affairs, as I'd been doing successfully for decades, didn't seem to occur to her. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I called my friend Eleanor, a woman I'd known since college, who'd dealt with similar family dynamics when her husband left her a substantial inheritance. "Margaret, I'm so glad you called," Eleanor said when she heard my voice. "How are you handling retirement?" "Actually, I'm calling because I could use some advice about dealing with adult children who think they know what's best for me." Eleanor laughed, but there was understanding in it. "Ah, you've discovered the curse of successful aging. You're too competent for them to ignore, but old enough for them to think they should manage you. What's going on?" I told her the whole story, from the months of condescending treatment, to the financial revelation, to their immediate pivot to wanting to help manage my money. Eleanor listened without interrupting, making the occasional sound of recognition. "Margaret, you're describing my life 3 years ago," she said when I finished. "My children were convinced I was too old to handle my own finances, despite the fact that I'd been managing money longer than they'd been alive. The difference was that my late husband had told them about our wealth, so they skipped the 'mom is delusional' phase and went straight to 'mom needs our help managing her inheritance.'" "What did you do?" "I gave them a choice. Respect my autonomy as a competent adult, or lose their inheritance. I told them I'd rather leave my money to charity than to children who thought I was incompetent to manage my own life." "Did it work?" "It took about 6 months, but yes. Once they realized I was serious, they had to confront their own assumptions about aging and competence. Now they treat me like the capable adult I am, and we have a much better relationship." After talking to Eleanor, I felt more confident about the path I was choosing. This wasn't about punishing my children out of spite. This was about teaching them that respect and inheritance weren't separate issues. If they couldn't respect my competence while I was alive, they couldn't expect to benefit from the wealth I'd accumulated through that competence after I died. The next morning, I called the estate attorney James had recommended. Catherine Mills had been practicing elder law for 20 years and understood the complexities of family financial dynamics. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to begin drafting the changes to my will. I also called the local community college and inquired about their continuing education programs. If I was going to establish a foundation focused on financial literacy for seniors, I wanted to understand what resources were already available and where the gaps might be. The research was eye-opening. While there were plenty of financial literacy programs for young adults, very few addressed the specific challenges facing older people. Issues like protecting yourself from financial abuse by family members, understanding your rights regarding financial decision-making, and maintaining autonomy while accepting appropriate support. As I dove deeper into the research, I realized that my experience with my children wasn't unusual. There was an entire category of elder financial abuse that involved well-meaning family members who gradually took control of older adults' finances under the guise of helping. Sometimes it was motivated by greed, but often it was driven by genuine but misguided concern, combined with ageist assumptions about declining competence. The more I learned, the more passionate I became about addressing this problem. My children's behavior had opened my eyes to a widespread issue that deserved attention and resources. That weekend, David showed up at my door unannounced, carrying a folder thick with printouts. "Mom, I've been doing research on tax strategies for high-net-worth individuals. I think you're missing out on some significant savings." I invited him in but didn't offer coffee. "David, what makes you think I'm not already using appropriate tax strategies?" He opened his folder eagerly, clearly prepared for this question. "Well, I've been reading about charitable remainder trusts and qualified personal residence trusts, and family limited partnerships. These are sophisticated strategies that most people don't know about. And you think your 72-year-old mother who's been managing investments for 40 years wouldn't know about basic estate planning tools?" David's enthusiasm faltered slightly. "I'm not saying you don't know about them. I'm saying that maybe you haven't had time to implement them. These things can be complicated." "David, sit down. We need to have a conversation." He sat on my couch, still clutching his folder of research. I could see that he'd spent considerable time preparing for this visit, probably imagining himself as the helpful son who would save his mother from financial inefficiency. Yesterday, you thought I was delusional about having money for a cruise. Today, you're here with sophisticated tax strategies. What changed? I learned that you have significant assets that need proper management. No, David, you learned that there was more money involved than you'd realized. But your fundamental assumption that I need your help hasn't changed. You've just upgraded from thinking I need help with basic spending decisions to thinking I need help with complex financial planning. David shifted uncomfortably. Mom, I'm trying to help. I don't want you to pay more taxes than necessary. Who says I'm paying more taxes than necessary? Did you ask about my current tax strategies before deciding I needed your help? He was quiet for a moment. I assumed you might not be aware of all the options. Based on what? Based on the fact that I'm old? Based on the assumption that advanced age equals financial incompetence? That's not fair, Mom. I was just trying to help. David, help involves asking someone what they need and respecting their answer. What you're doing is assuming you know better than I do about my own financial situation and trying to fix problems that may not exist. I could see him struggling with the concept. Like his sisters, David had genuinely believed he was being helpful. The idea that his help might be unwanted or unnecessary was difficult for him to process. But Mom, if you have this kind of money, don't you want to make sure it's being handled optimally? It is being handled optimally. By me, with the help of professionals I've carefully chosen over many years. David, I don't need you to manage my money. I need you to respect that I'm capable of managing it myself. After David left, looking confused and slightly hurt, I realized that each conversation with my children was following the same pattern. They couldn't seem to grasp that respecting my autonomy meant accepting that I might not want or need their input, even if they thought their suggestions were valuable. That evening, I sat down and wrote 3 letters, one to each of my children. In each letter, I explained that I was disappointed in how they'd treated me over the past year, not because they'd been wrong about my finances, but because they'd been unwilling to respect my competence as an adult. I told them that I was changing my will, and that their inheritance would be significantly reduced, with the majority of my wealth going to establish a foundation focused on protecting elderly people from financial abuse. I also gave them a choice. If they could demonstrate over the next 6 months that they respected my autonomy and competence, I would reconsider the changes. But respect meant accepting my decisions without trying to manage, improve, or control them. It meant treating me like the capable adult I was, not the confused elderly woman they'd imagined me to be. I sealed the letters and put them in my purse. Tomorrow, I would deliver them in person. My children thought they understood what delusion looked like. They were about to learn that the biggest delusion had been their own belief that love gave them the right to control someone else's life. The foundation I was planning would ensure that other elderly people wouldn't have to choose between maintaining their autonomy and maintaining their family relationships. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your children is to teach them that respect and inheritance are connected, and that taking someone's competence for granted might cost them more than they ever imagined. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future. For too long, I'd been allowing my children's assumptions to make me question my own judgment. But discovering the strength to stand up for my autonomy had reminded me of who I really was. I was Margaret Walsh, a competent 72-year-old woman who'd built a fortune through careful planning and smart decisions. And I was just getting started. The following Tuesday morning, I drove to Rebecca's office first. Her law firm occupied 3 floors of a downtown Denver high-rise, all glass and steel that projected success and authority. The receptionist knew me and smiled warmly as she announced my arrival. Rebecca came out to greet me personally, something she rarely did for family visits during business hours. "Mom, what a wonderful surprise. Come back to my office." She was using her professional voice, the one that suggested important business was about to be conducted. As we walked past her colleagues, I could see her pride in showing off her mother to people who probably assumed all elderly parents were burdens, rather than assets. Her corner office overlooked the city, with diplomas and awards covering one wall and family photos strategically placed on her desk. She gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing her desk, positioning herself in the power seat behind it. "I'm so glad you came by." I've been working on some preliminary ideas for optimizing your portfolio. She reached for a folder that was clearly prepared in advance. I think you'll be impressed with what we could accomplish working together. I remained standing and placed my letter on her desk. Rebecca, I need you to read this. Her expression shifted as she recognized this wasn't the collaborative financial planning session she'd anticipated. She opened the envelope carefully, her lawyer's training evident in how she examined the formal letterhead I'd used. As she read, I watched her face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. Mom, this is ridiculous. You're punishing us for caring about you. Read it again, Rebecca. I'm not punishing you for caring. I'm responding to a year of being treated like an incompetent child, followed by immediate attempts to control my financial decisions, once you learned they were worth controlling. She stood up abruptly, the letter crumpled in her hand. We were trying to protect you, we thought you were making poor decisions. Without ever asking me about those decisions. Without ever considering that you might not have complete information about my situation, you assumed I was incompetent and acted accordingly. But we were wrong about the money. We admitted that. Why can't we move past it? I sat down then, looking directly at her across the expensive desk that represented everything she'd accomplished in her career. Rebecca, what's the first thing you did after learning about my wealth? I apologized. After you apologized, what was the very next thing you did? She was quiet, probably realizing where this was heading. You immediately began positioning yourself as my financial advisor. You couldn't conceive of a scenario where your newly wealthy mother might not need or want your input. You moved seamlessly from thinking I was incompetent to manage $15,000 to assuming I needed your help. Managing $4 million. I have expertise in financial matters. I was trying to be helpful. Helpful would have been asking if I wanted your help and accepting my answer. What you did was assume I needed your help and proceed accordingly. The assumption that you know better than I do about my own life hasn't changed, Rebecca. Only the scale has changed. She sat back down, her professional composure cracking. Mom, I don't understand what you want from us. I want you to treat me like a competent adult. I want you to respect my decisions even when you disagree with them. I want you to stop assuming that being my daughter gives you the right to manage my life. And if we can't do that, I stood up to leave. Then you'll inherit exactly what the letter specifies. Enough to know I loved you, but not enough to reward disrespect. The conversation with David was different but equally revealing. I found him at a job site where he was overseeing the renovation of a historic downtown building. He was in his element here, directing workers and solving practical problems with the kind of competence that had made him successful in construction. When he saw me approaching with an envelope, his face lit up. Mom, perfect timing. I wanted to show you something. He led me to a quiet corner of the construction site and pulled out his phone. I've been researching real estate investment trusts. I think we could significantly improve your portfolio's income stream. I handed him the letter without preamble. David, read this first. He wiped his dusty hands on his jeans before opening the envelope. Unlike Rebecca, he read it twice before responding, his methodical nature evident even in how he processed difficult information. Mom, I understand you're upset, but this seems extreme. We're family, we should be working together. Working together implies equal partnership, David. What you've been proposing is you providing guidance to your incompetent mother. He leaned against a stack of lumber, his hard hat pushed back on his head. I never said you were incompetent. You suggested I needed medical evaluation because I wanted to take a cruise. You've spent the last week researching investment strategies to save me from my own financial inefficiency. What would you call that? I'd call it being concerned about someone I love. David, when you're working on a construction project, how do you feel when someone with no construction experience comes to the job site and starts suggesting improvements to your work? He shifted uncomfortably. That's different. This is family. It's exactly the same. You're an expert in construction. I'm an expert in my own financial situation. But you feel entitled to override my expertise because you think family relationships give you that right. David was quiet for several minutes, watching his workers carry materials across the site. Finally, he looked back at me. Mom, are you really going to disinherit us over this? I'm going to stop rewarding disrespect with financial benefit. If you can learn to treat me as an equal rather than as someone who needs your management, we can revisit the inheritance question. Sarah's reaction was the most emotional. I found her at her yoga studio during the break between her morning classes. She was sitting in the empty studio, still wearing her yoga clothes, when I arrived with her letter. She read it while sitting cross-legged on her yoga mat, tears streaming down her face before she finished the first paragraph. Mom, this is devastating. I thought we were finally going to have a closer relationship now that we understood your situation better. Sarah, a closer relationship based on what? Based on you helping me spend my money? Based on you researching charitable organizations for me to support? Based on being honest with each other? Based on me being able to help you in meaningful ways? I sat down on the mat across from her, something I never would have done 6 months ago when my confidence was shattered by their constant implications that I was losing my capabilities. Sarah, what makes you think I need help with charitable giving? I've been making donations for decades. Did you ask me about my current philanthropic activities before deciding I needed your research? She wiped her eyes with a tissue. I thought with more money, you might want to make a bigger impact. I am making a bigger impact. I'm establishing a foundation to protect elderly people from financial abuse by family members. I'm addressing a problem I experienced firsthand. Are you saying we financially abused you? I'm saying you systematically undermined my confidence in my own judgment, dismissed my financial reality, and then immediately tried to control my financial decisions once you learned they were worth controlling. What would you call that? Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. Finally, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Mom, I don't think any of us realized how our behavior was affecting you. We genuinely thought we were helping. Sarah, impact matters more than intention. The impact of your behavior was to make me question my own competence and autonomy. The fact that you meant well doesn't change the damage that was done. Over the next few weeks, my children's responses to my ultimatum revealed everything I needed to know about their true priorities. Rebecca hired her own estate attorney to research whether she could challenge my will changes. David began documenting every financial decision I made, apparently building a case that I was acting irrationally out of spite. Sarah started therapy but also began pressuring other family members to intervene on their behalf. None of them demonstrated any understanding that the issue wasn't about money. It was about respect, autonomy, and the fundamental question of whether they could see me as a competent adult, rather than as an elderly person who needed their guidance. 3 months after delivering the letters, I received a joint email from all 3 of my children. They had coordinated their response, probably with Rebecca providing legal guidance and Sarah managing the emotional messaging. The email acknowledged that they had made mistakes in how they'd handled my financial situation, but it also detailed all the ways they planned to, quote, support me better going forward. Reading their proposed solutions was like looking at a more sophisticated version of the same fundamental problem. They wanted to create a family financial advisory committee. They proposed quarterly meetings to review my spending and investment decisions. They suggested establishing a family trust that would provide them with oversight capabilities, while protecting my assets for future generations. Every single suggestion involved them having input, oversight, or control over my financial decisions. They still couldn't conceive of a relationship where they respected my autonomy without trying to manage it. I deleted the email without responding. 6 months after my ultimatum, Catherine Mills called to inform me that Rebecca had filed a legal challenge to my will changes, claiming I was suffering from diminished capacity due to age-related cognitive decline. The irony was perfect. My daughter, who was a lawyer, was arguing in court that her mother was too mentally impotent to decide how to distribute her own wealth. The legal challenge required me to undergo cognitive testing, something I welcomed. The results showed that my mental faculties were not only intact, but superior to average for my age group. The psychologist who administered the tests noted in her report that I demonstrated exceptional clarity of thought and sound judgment. Rebecca's legal challenge was dismissed, but not before it revealed the depths of her entitlement. She genuinely believed that discovering my wealth gave her family rights over how it was distributed. The possibility that I might be competent to make my own estate planning decisions was something she was willing to challenge in court rather than accept. A year after delivering my ultimatum letters, I signed the final documents establishing the Margaret and Robert Walsh Foundation for Elder Financial Autonomy. The foundation would provide education, resources, and advocacy for elderly people facing financial pressure from family members. It would also fund legal assistance for seniors dealing with guardianship challenges and other attempts to undermine their financial independence. James Morrison had become not just my financial advisor but also the foundation's first board member. Eleanor, my friend who had dealt with similar family dynamics, agreed to serve as well. We recruited professionals from elder law, social work, and financial planning to create a comprehensive approach to protecting senior financial autonomy. The day I signed the foundation documents, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond the financial impact the foundation would have. I had transformed my own experience of being dismissed and undermined into something that would help others facing similar challenges. That evening, David showed up at my door. He looked older somehow, worn down by the year of family conflict. I invited him in and made coffee, something I hadn't done for any of my children since delivering the ultimatum letters. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that's happened this year," he said, settling into his familiar spot on my couch. "I think I'm starting to understand what you were trying to tell us." "What do you think I was trying to tell you?" "That we were treating you like a child instead of like our mother. That we were so focused on what we thought you needed that we never listened to what you actually wanted." I studied his face, looking for signs that this was another attempt at manipulation. But David had never been good at hiding his true feelings, and what I saw was genuine remorse. "What made you realize that?" "My girlfriend broke up with me last month. She said I was always trying to fix her problems instead of listening to her feelings. She said I treated her like a project instead of a partner. It reminded me of our conversations about your finances." "How so?" "I realized I'd been treating you the same way. Like someone who needed my help instead of someone whose judgment I should respect. Like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be heard." This was the first conversation I'd had with any of my children that focused on my feelings rather than their intentions. It was the first time one of them had acknowledged that their behavior had affected me rather than defending their motivations. "David, why do you think it took your girlfriend breaking up with you to understand something I'd been telling you directly for months?" He was quiet for a long time. "Because I didn't want to believe I was capable of being disrespectful to someone I love. It was easier to think you were being unreasonable than to admit I was being controlling. And now? Now I understand that love without respect isn't actually love. It's just possession with good intentions." Over the next several months, David was the only one of my children who made genuine changes in how he interacted with me. He stopped offering unsolicited advice about my finances. He asked permission before making suggestions about anything related to my life. Most importantly, he accepted my answers without argument, even when he disagreed with my decisions. Rebecca and Sarah, meanwhile, continued to operate under the assumption that the problem was my stubbornness, rather than their disrespect. Rebecca sent periodic emails with financial articles she thought I should read. Sarah continued to research charitable organizations and estate planning strategies, apparently believing that if she found the right information, I would realize I needed her help. 2 years after establishing the foundation, I updated my will one final time. David, who had demonstrated consistent respect for my autonomy, was restored as a primary beneficiary. Rebecca and Sarah each received modest bequests, along with letters explaining that inheritance was a privilege earned through respect, not a right guaranteed by DNA. The foundation had already helped more than 100 elderly people maintain their financial independence in the face of family pressure. We'd provided legal assistance to seniors fighting inappropriate guardianship proceedings, educational workshops on recognizing financial manipulation, and advocacy services for those dealing with controlling family members. The most rewarding part was the letters I received from people who had found the courage to stand up for their own autonomy after learning about our work. Many of them described family situations remarkably similar to my own experience. Children who confused love with control and assumed that aging automatically meant declining competence. On my 75th birthday, I celebrated with a small group of friends and David. Rebecca and Sarah sent cards but didn't attend, still apparently hoping that maintaining distance would pressure me to reconsider my decisions. As I looked around my dining room at the people who had gathered to celebrate with me, I realized that my children's accusations about living in Delulu land had been projection. They had been the ones living in delusion, imagining that love gave them the right to control my life and that inheritance was something they deserved rather than something they needed to earn. The real delusion had been their belief that they could undermine my competence for months and then immediately claim expertise over my financial decisions once they learned those decisions involved significant wealth. They had convinced themselves that their intentions justified their behavior, even when that behavior was fundamentally disrespectful. My foundation's work had taught me that this dynamic was depressingly common. Adult children often gradually assumed control over their parents' finances under the guise of protection, rarely recognizing that competent elderly people had the same right to autonomy as any other adult. The most important lesson I'd learned was that respect and inheritance were fundamentally connected. If my children couldn't respect my judgment while I was alive, they had no claim to benefit from the wealth I'd accumulated through that judgment after I died. Standing up for my autonomy had cost me relationships with two of my children, at least temporarily. But it had also allowed me to create something meaningful from my experience, to protect other elderly people from similar manipulation, and to demonstrate that being 75 didn't mean accepting disrespect from anyone, including family. As I blew out my birthday candles, I made a wish that more elderly people would find the courage to demand respect from their families, and that more families would learn to see aging parents as competent adults rather than as problems to be managed. The biggest delusion hadn't been mine. It had been my children's belief that they could inherit my money while disrespecting my mind. They had learned, perhaps too late, that financial legacy and personal respect were inseparable, and that assuming incompetence in someone you love might cost you more than you ever imagined possible. 3 years into running the foundation, I received a call that would test everything I'd learned about family dynamics and financial autonomy. It was from a woman named Patricia Chen, and her voice shook as she explained her situation. "Mrs. Walsh, I heard about your foundation through my neighbor. I think my son is trying to have me declared incompetent so he can control my finances. I don't know what to do." I scheduled a meeting with Patricia for the following afternoon. When she arrived at my office, I saw a woman in her late 60s, impeccably dressed and clearly articulate, but carrying herself with the defeated posture of someone whose confidence had been systematically undermined. "Tell me what's been happening," I said, offering her tea and settling into the comfortable chairs I'd chosen specifically to make our office feel welcoming rather than institutional. Patricia's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Her son Michael had become increasingly involved in her finances over the past year, initially presenting himself as a helpful adult, child concerned about his widowed mother's well-being. But his help had gradually become control, and his concern had transformed into accusations that she was becoming forgetful and making poor decisions. "He started by suggesting I shouldn't drive at night anymore," Patricia explained. "Then he said I was forgetting conversations we'd had. He convinced my doctor that I needed someone to help manage my medications. Before I knew it, he was coming to all my medical appointments and speaking for me like I wasn't even there." The pattern was exactly what our foundation had identified in dozens of similar cases. Adult children who gradually assumed control over various aspects of their parents' life, using concerns about safety and competence as justification for increasingly invasive oversight. "Patricia, what happened that made you realize something was wrong?" "Last week, I went to make a charitable donation to the animal shelter where I volunteer, and I discovered that Michael had moved most of my money into accounts that require his signature for withdrawals. When I confronted him, he said he was protecting me from scammers and impulsive spending." "How much money are we talking about?" "Just over $600,000. My husband and I saved carefully for retirement, and I've been living modestly on the interest and my Social Security. But now I can't access my own money without my son's permission." I felt the familiar anger that came with hearing these stories. Patricia was clearly competent, articulate, and capable of managing her own affairs. But her son had used her trust and his position as family to gradually strip away her financial independence. "Patricia, have you considered legal action?" "That's just it. Michael is a lawyer. He knows exactly how to make everything look legitimate. He's been documenting every time I forget a small detail or make what he considers a questionable purchase. He's building a case that I'm suffering from cognitive decline. This was the most insidious part of financial abuse by family members. They often used their intimate knowledge of someone's habits and personality to manufacture evidence of incompetence. A forgotten grocery list became evidence of memory problems. A spontaneous purchase became proof of poor judgment. Patricia, I want you to know that what you're describing is financial abuse, even though it's being perpetrated by your son. The foundation can help you, but I need to be honest about what fighting this will involve. Over the next 2 hours, I explained our process. We would arrange for independent cognitive testing to document her mental competence. We would help her find an elder law attorney who could challenge the financial arrangements her son had created. Most importantly, we would provide emotional support throughout what would likely be a difficult and painful process of standing up to family manipulation. The hardest part, I told Patricia, will be accepting that your son's behavior isn't motivated by love and concern, even though that's how he's presenting it. It's motivated by a desire for control, possibly financial gain, and definitely a fundamental lack of respect for your autonomy. Patricia nodded, tears in her eyes. I kept thinking that if I could just prove to him that I'm still competent, he would back off. But the more I try to prove my competence, the more examples he finds of what he considers poor judgment. That's because the issue isn't actually your competence. The issue is his entitlement to control your life. No amount of proving your capability will satisfy someone who fundamentally believes they have the right to manage you. Working with Patricia over the following months reminded me of my own journey with my children. The patterns were remarkably similar, even though the specific circumstances were different. Adult children who confused love with control. Elderly parents who initially tried to accommodate family concerns before realizing they were being manipulated. And a gradual erosion of autonomy that happened so slowly it was difficult to recognize until significant damage had been done. Patricia's case also highlighted how gender and cultural expectations complicated these dynamics. As a widowed woman, she faced assumptions that she needed protection and guidance in ways that widowed men rarely encountered. Her son's protective stance was seen as admirable by many people who didn't understand that protection without consent was actually control. The cognitive testing confirmed what I already knew. Patricia scored in the superior range for her age group, with no signs of dementia or significant cognitive decline. Her financial knowledge was extensive, and her judgment on hypothetical scenarios was sound. The psychologist who administered the tests noted that Patricia demonstrated excellent insight and reasoning abilities. Armed with this documentation, our foundation's legal team challenged the financial arrangements her son had created. The case took 8 months to resolve, during which Michael escalated his claims about his mother's incompetence, apparently believing that if he could convince a judge she was declining, he could maintain control over her finances. The turning point came when Michael made a crucial error. During a deposition, he claimed that his mother had given him power of attorney because she recognized her own cognitive decline. But when our attorney asked him to produce documentation of this conversation, he couldn't provide any. Furthermore, the power of attorney document had been signed on a day when Patricia could prove she had been volunteering at the animal shelter, surrounded by witnesses who could testify to her mental clarity. The judge not only invalidated the financial arrangements Michael had created, but also ordered him to pay restitution for the funds he had moved without his mother's consent. More importantly, the court issued a restraining order, preventing him from interfering with Patricia's financial decisions in the future. I feel like I have my life back, Patricia told me after the final court hearing, but I also feel like I've lost my son. He's so angry about the court decision that he's not speaking to me. This was the tragic reality of many cases our foundation handled. Standing up to financial abuse by family members often meant sacrificing relationships with those family members, at least temporarily. Some adult children eventually recognized their behavior and worked to rebuild trust. Others, like my daughters Rebecca and Sarah, remained convinced that their parents were being unreasonable rather than accepting that their own behavior had been inappropriate. Patricia's case led to a significant expansion of our foundation's work. We began offering support groups for elderly people dealing with controlling family members, recognizing that the emotional impact of these situations was often as damaging as the financial manipulation. The support groups revealed common themes across different families and circumstances. Adult children who gradually increased their involvement in their parents' lives until that involvement became control. Elderly parents who initially appreciated the help but slowly realized they had lost their independence. Family dynamics where expressing concerns about the adult child's behavior was met with increased claims about the parent's declining competence. One of the most powerful moments in our support group work came when Patricia shared her story with a man named Robert, whose daughter had been systematically isolating him from his friends while claiming she was protecting him from people who might take advantage of him. "I thought I was the only one dealing with this," Robert said after hearing Patricia's experience. "My daughter has convinced most of our family that I'm becoming paranoid and difficult. But listening to your story, I realize that her behavior follows the exact same pattern." These connections between people facing similar situations became one of the Foundation's most valuable services. Elderly people who had been isolated and gaslighted by family members found validation and support from others who understood their experiences firsthand. As our work expanded, I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences about elder abuse and financial exploitation. Initially, I was hesitant to share my personal story publicly, but I came to understand that my experience with my own children provided credibility and relatability that academic research alone couldn't achieve. During one particularly memorable speaking engagement at a national conference on aging, I was approached afterward by a social worker who had been struggling with a case involving an elderly woman whose children were trying to force her into assisted living, despite her obvious competence. "Your presentation helped me understand that this isn't about the woman's capability," the social worker said. "It's about her children's assumptions and entitlement. I've been trying to help her prove she's competent, when what she really needs is help standing up to their manipulation." This conversation led to the development of our professional training program. We began offering workshops for social workers, healthcare providers, and legal professionals on recognizing financial abuse by family members and understanding the difference between appropriate support and inappropriate control. The training emphasized that competent elderly people had the same right to make decisions that others might consider unwise as any other adult. The fact that someone was old didn't give their family members the right to override their judgment, even if that judgment involved financial choices the family disagreed with. 5 years after establishing the foundation, I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee that was considering strengthening protections for elderly people facing financial exploitation. As I sat in the hearing room, preparing to share my story with lawmakers who had the power to create systemic change, I reflected on how far my journey had taken me from that initial Thanksgiving dinner, when my children first dismissed my financial reality. Committee members, I'm here today not just as the founder of a nonprofit organization, but as someone who experienced firsthand how well-meaning family members can gradually strip away an elderly person's autonomy while convincing themselves they're providing loving care. I told them about my children's assumptions about my finances, their dismissal of my competence, and their immediate attempts to control my decisions once they learned the truth about my wealth. I explained how this experience had opened my eyes to a widespread problem that affected thousands of elderly people who were being manipulated by family members who confused love with control. "The legislation you're considering today," I concluded, "would provide important protections for elderly people who find themselves in situations like mine. But more importantly, it would send a clear message that aging doesn't automatically mean losing the right to make your own decisions, even when family members disagree with those decisions." The legislation passed, creating stronger penalties for financial abuse of elderly people and establishing clearer guidelines for when family members could legitimately intervene in someone's financial affairs. It also funded expanded support services for elderly people dealing with family manipulation. As I drove home from the state capitol that day, I thought about how my children's accusations that I was living in Delulu land had ultimately led to meaningful change in how society approached elder financial autonomy. Their delusion about my competence had become the foundation for protecting other elderly people from similar delusions. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children had been right about one thing. I had been living in a kind of delusion. But it wasn't a delusion about having money I didn't possess. It was a delusion that family members who loved me would naturally respect my autonomy and competence. Learning to shed that delusion and demand respect, regardless of family relationships, had been the most empowering experience of my later years. Now, at 78, I continue to run the foundation with the same energy and determination that had characterized my investment decisions decades earlier. David had become increasingly involved in the foundation's work, having learned from his own experience how love without respect could damage relationships. Rebecca and Sarah sent occasional birthday cards but remained convinced that I had been unreasonable rather than recognizing their own behavior patterns. The foundation had helped over 500 elderly people maintain their financial independence, influenced legislation in 3 states, and changed how thousands of professionals approached elder autonomy issues. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that being dismissed and underestimated could become the catalyst for creating meaningful change. As I locked up the foundation office each evening, I felt the satisfaction of someone who had transformed a personal injustice into a force for protecting others. My children's delusion about my competence had led to their exclusion from my inheritance, but it had also led to a legacy that would protect elderly people long after I was gone. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is to prove that the person doing the underestimating was the one who was truly delusional. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.